Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing? And hope you all are having a wonderful morning. You're ready for another podcast today. To recap, last time we went over the Metroidvania series, Metroidvania subgenre of the action adventure genre, and then we just kind of did an overview of the adventure game genre, which we'll do another quick recap of that right now, and then we'll jump into the subgenres that require it. So, the adventure game genre is one of the earliest types of games that were created, beginning with the text adventure Colossal Cave Adventure in the 1970s. That game was originally titled simply Adventure and is the namesake of the genre. Over time, graphics have been introduced to the genre and the interface has evolved. Unlike adventure films, adventure games are not defined by story or content. Rather, adventure describes a manner of gameplay without reflex challenges or action. They normally require the player to solve various puzzles by interacting with people or the environment, most often in a non-confrontational way. It is considered a purist genre and tends to exclude anything which includes action elements beyond a minigame, because they put little pressure on the player in the form of action-based challenges or time constraints. Adventure games have had the unique ability to appeal to people who do not normally play video games. The genre peaked in popularity with the 1993 release of Myst, the best-selling PC game of all time up to that point. The simple point-and-click interface, detailed worlds, and casual pace made it accessible, and its sense of artistic surrealism caused news outlets such as Wired Magazine, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle to declare that the gaming industry had matured. It had 4 proper sequels, but none managed to experience the same level of success. The success of Myst also inspired many others to create games with first-person perspectives, surreal environments, and minimal or no dialogue. But these neither recaptured the success of Myst nor of earlier personality-driven adventures. I remember going into the library one time looking for movies and books and seeing like all the computer games being offered, because that was when they were starting to offer video games at the libraries. I mean, this was still before a lot of libraries were offering some pretty big games, but like I remember seeing the case that these CDs came in. Like, it was bigger than a book. The thing would be like just a huge plastic behemoth type thing. And it's just like, I wanted to play it, but I think my mom said no, because at the time it was rated T and I was like 10. And my mom very closely followed the guidelines of the rating system. So unfortunately, I couldn't play T games until I was a teen. I couldn't play M games until I moved out. Funnily enough, I was allowed to watch the Simpsons TV show, but I was not allowed to play Simpsons Road Rage because it was rated T for teen because of the mild language. So the only way I was allowed to play this game was if I turned off the voices. So I had to play the game without any noise, any voices, none of it. Little sad, but hey. But we already did our discussion on the the rating systems of video games. Anyway, back to what we were going. In the late 1990s, the genre suffered a large drop in popularity. Mass market releases became rare, and many proclaimed the adventure game to be dead. More accurately, it has become a niche genre. Adventure games are not entirely uncommon, but they tend to be very low budget in anticipation of modest sales. The genre was somewhat rejuvenated with the release of The Longest Journey in 1999, which emphasized stronger story elements and more interaction with different characters. A recent resurgence of adventure games on Nintendo consoles might signify a new interest in the genre. A successful Kickstarter campaign in 2012, run by Double Fine Studios, also spoke to the continued interest in adventure games. The game produced as a result was mired in controversy and production delays, and to some signaled the true end of the genre outside of niche markets. So, let's see. The first thing we're going to jump into are the text adventures, which are also known as interactive fiction. Now, I've heard a lot of things about interactive fiction. Apparently, there's a free-to-play game somewhere. I don't remember the name, but it's one of those that no matter what you put in, it always is adapting around your story. So I have to remember to go look that up again at some point. But I don't remember where or when I saw it or heard about it. I heard about it in a video, and the videos I watch tend to be hours long, so trying to find it is very difficult. So, anyway. So, interactive fiction, often abbreviated IF, is software simulating environments in which players use text commands to control characters and influence the environment. Works in this form can be understood as literary narratives, either in the form of interactive narratives or interactive narrations. These works can also be understood as a form of video game, either in the form of an adventure game or role-playing game. In common usage, the term refers to text adventures, a type of adventure game where the entire interface can be text only. However, graphical text adventures still fall under the text adventure category if the main way to interact with the game is by typing text. Sub-users of the term distinguish between interactive fiction, known as puzzle-free, that focuses on just narration, and text adventures that generally focus on puzzles. Due to their text-only nature, they sidestep the problem of writing for widely divergent graphics architectures. This feature meant that interactive fiction games were easily ported across all popular platforms at the time, including CPM, not known for gaming or strong graphic capabilities. The number of interactive fiction works is increasing steadily as new ones are produced by an online community using freely available development systems. The term can also be used to refer to digital versions of literary works that are not read in a linear fashion, known as game books, where the readers instead given choices at different points in the text. These decisions determine the flow and outcome of the story. The most famous example of this form of printed fiction is the Choose Your Adventures book series, and collaborative adventure format has also been described as a form of interactive fiction. The term interactive fiction is sometimes used also to refer to visual novels, a type of interactive narrative software popular in Japan. I remember there were several Goosebumps books that use the Choose Your Own Adventure plotline. It's pretty interesting. I haven't thought about the Goosebumps books in years. Holy crap. I have a good handful of them waiting at my parents' house. I need to get those at some point soon. And like a dozen more bookshelves. But, okay. So, let's see. Medium. Text adventures are one of the oldest types of computer games and form a subset of the adventure genre. The player uses text input to control the game, and the game state is relayed to the player via text output. Interactive fiction usually relies on reading from a screen and on typing input, although text-to-speech synthesizers allow blind and visually impaired users to play interactive fiction titles such as audio games. Input is usually provided by the player in the form of a simple sentence such as get key or go east, which are interpreted by a text parser. Parsers may vary in sophistication. The first adventure parser could only handle 2-word sentences in the form of verb-noun pairs. Later parsers, such as those built on ZIL or Zork implementation language, could understand complete sentences. Later, parsers could handle increasing levels of complexity, parsing sentences such as open the red box with the green key, then go north. This level of complexity is the standard for works of interactive fiction today. Despite their lack of graphics, text adventures include a physical dimension where the players move between rooms. Many text adventure games boasted their total number of rooms to indicate how much gameplay they offered. These games are unique in that they may create an illogical space where going north from Area A takes you to Area B, but going south from Area B did not take you back to Area A. This can create mazes that do not behave as players expect, and thus players must maintain their own map. These illogical spaces are much more rare in today's era of 3D gaming, and the interactive fiction community in general decries the use of mazes entirely, claiming that mazes have become arbitrary puzzles for the sake of puzzles, and that they can, in the hands of inexperienced designers, become immensely frustrating for players to navigate. Which I can understand that. Like, you don't want to go in and be like, oh my god, there's just a puzzle and a puzzle and a puzzle. And to solve the first puzzle, you have to actually get to the 7th puzzle, which gives you a clue to the 3rd puzzle, which gives you a clue to the 5th puzzle, which allows you to solve the 5th puzzle, which actually gives you the answer to the first 3 puzzles. And then from there, you can go to the 8th puzzle, where you'll get a clue on how to get to the final room. The final room will give you the key to solving puzzles 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then you come back here with the decipher decoded, and then you win. Interactive fiction shares much in common with multi-user dungeons, or MUDs. MUDs, which became popular in the mid-1980s, rely on textual exchange and accept similar commands from players as do works of IF. However, since interactive fiction is single player and MUDs, by definition, have multiple players, they differ enormously in gameplay styles. MUDs often focus gameplay on activities that involve communities of players, simulated political systems, in-game trading, and other gameplay mechanics that are not possible in a single player environment. Writing style. Interactive fiction features 2 distinct modes of writing: the player input and the game output. As described above, player input is expected to be a single command, imperative sentences. A typical command may be pull lever. The responses from the games are usually written from a second-person perspective in present tense. This is because, unlike in most works of fiction, the main character is closely associated with the player, and the events are seen to be happening as the player sees, while older text adventures often identify the protagonist with the player directly. Newer games tend to have specific, well-defined protagonists with separate identities from the player. The classic essay Crimes Against Mimesis discusses... is it Mimesis? Mimesis. I don't know. Among other IF issues, the nature of you in interactive fiction. A typical response might look something like this: the response to look in tea chest at the start of Curses. That was the first place you tried, hours and hours ago now, and there's nothing there but that boring old book. You pick it up anyway, bored as you are. Mimesis. Why is there an A? Why is it A? Whatever. Many text adventures, particularly those designed for humor, such as Zork, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and Leather Goddess of Phobos, address the player with an informal tone, sometimes sarcastic response. Remarks, see the transcript from Curses above, for example. Um. Oh, that's cold. Rip. The late Douglas Adams, in designing the IF version of his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, created a unique solution to the final puzzle of the game. The game requires one solitary item that the player did not choose at the outset of play. Wind chill has it at 0 degrees, possible of -6. So, a little cold here. Oh, sorry. Forecast values of -5. Some IF works dispense with second-person narrative entirely, opting for first-person perspective, I, or even placing the player in the position of the observer rather than a direct participant. In some experimental IF, the concept of self-identification is eliminated entirely. The player instead takes the role of an inanimate object, a force of nature, or an abstract concept. Experimental IF usually pushes the limits of the concept and challenges many assumptions about the medium. Let's look at the modern era of interactive fiction. After the decline of the commercial interactive fiction market in the 1990s, an online community eventually formed around the medium. In 1987, the Usenet news group, rec.arts.int-fiction, was created and was soon followed by rec.games.inf/fiction. By custom, the topic of that plays is interactive fiction authorship and programming, while the .games so the .arts is about authorship and programming, and the .games encompasses topics related to playing interactive fiction games such as hint requests and game reviews. As of late 2011, discussion between writers have mostly moved from .arts to the interactive fiction community forum. One of the most important early developments was the reverse engineering of Infocom's Z-code format in the Z-Machine virtual machine. In 1987 by a group of enthusiasts called the Info Task Force, and the subsequent development of an interpreter for Z-code story files. As a result, it became possible to play Infocom's work on modern computers. For years, amateurs with the IF community produced interactive fiction works of relatively limited scope using the adventure game toolkit and similar tools. The breakthrough that allowed the interactive fiction community to truly prosper, however, was the creation and distribution of two sophisticated development systems. In 1987, Michael J. Roberts released TADS, a programming language designed to produce works of interactive fiction. In 1993, Graham Nelson released Inform, a programming language and set of libraries which compiled to a Z-code story file. Each of these systems allowed anyone with sufficient time and dedication to create a game and caused a growth boom in the online interactive fiction community. Despite the lack of commercial support, the availability of high-quality tools allowed enthusiasts of the genre to develop new high-quality games. Competitions such as the annual Interactive Fiction Competition for short works, the Spring Thing for longer works, and the XYZZY Awards further help to improve the quality and complexity of the games. Modern games go much further than the original adventure style, improving upon Infocom games, which relied extensively on puzzle solving and to a lesser extent on communication with non-player characters, to include experimentation with writing and storytelling techniques. While the majority of modern interactive fiction is distributed for free, there are some commercial endeavors. In 1998, Michael Berlin, a former implementer at Infocom, started a new game company, Cascade Mountain Publishing, whose goals were to publish interactive fiction. Despite the interactive fiction community providing social and financial backing, Cascade Mountain Publishing went out of business only 2 years later in 2000. Other commercial endeavors include Peter Nepstad's 1893 A World's Fair Mystery, several games by Howard Sherman published as Malinch Entertainment, the General Coffee Company's Future Boy Cipher, a graphically enhanced cyberpunk game, and various titles by Textfire. Emily Short was commissioned to develop the game City of Secrets, but the project fell through and she ended up releasing it herself. Artificial intelligence. This is the name of it. So, the increased effectiveness of natural language generation in artificial intelligence has led to instances of interactive fiction which uses AI to dynamically generate new open-ended content instead of being constrained by pre-written material. The most notable example of this is AI Dungeon, released in 2019, which generates content using the GPT-3 natural language generating neural network created by OpenAI. So AI Dungeon, let me open this up since this is a great example of interactive fiction. AI Dungeon is a free-to-play, single-player, and multiplayer text adventure game which uses artificial intelligence to generate unlimited content. It also allows players to create and share their own custom adventure settings. The game's first release was made available on Collab in 2019, and the second version, initially called AI Dungeon 2, was released online and for iOS and Android in December of 2019. The AI model was then upgraded in July of 2020. AI Dungeon is a text adventure game. However, unlike traditional text adventure games, which uses pre-written content, AI Dungeon uses artificial intelligence to generate effectively limitless open-ended storylines. Like, for instance, the YouTuber who I heard about this from initially, he started off with the cyberpunk, which turned into a fantasy setting, which turned into Pokemon, which turned into Yu-Gi-Oh!, which turned into him dying, but saying that's against the rules and getting resurrected. So it literally will adapt to everything you do. So when first beginning the game, players are greeted by the following opening. You're about to enter a world of endless possibilities where you can do absolutely anything you can imagine. Will you proceed? Players are then prompted to choose a setting for their adventure, e.g. fantasy, mystery, apocalyptic, cyberpunk, zombies, followed by other options relevant to the setting, such as character class for fantasy settings. After beginning an adventure, there are three main interaction methods that can be chosen for each of the player's pieces of text input. Do must be followed by a verb, allowing the player to perform an action. Say must be followed by dialogue sentences, allowing players to communicate with other characters. Story can be followed by sentences describing something that happens to progress the story or that the player wants the AI to know for future events. The game's artificial intelligence allows it to adapt and respond to almost any action entered by the player. Providing blank input can also be used to prompt the AI to generate further content, and the game also provides players with options to undo, redo, or modify recent events in order to improve the game's narrative. Players are also given the ability to explicitly tell the AI what elements to remember for reference in future parts of their playthrough. In addition to pre-configured settings available in AI Dungeon, players have the ability to create entirely custom adventures from scratch, simply by describing the setting in text format. The AI will then generate a setting based on the user's input. Custom adventures that players create can be published for others to play through on their own. The game provides an interface for browsing published adventures, along with the ability to leave comments and upvote like each one. I don't know where to find this game, but you should be able to search it online and be able to easily find it. I'm not going to read too much more into it. For anybody who's actually interested, you can go ahead and take a look at it yourself. But that is the interactive fiction, the text adventures, and graphic adventures. Next up is the Escape the Room. Escape the Room, also known as Room Escape or Escape Game, is a subgenre of point-and-click adventure game, which requires a player to escape from imprisonment by exploiting their surroundings. The room usually consists of a locked door, objects to manipulate, and hidden clues or secret compartments. The player must use the objects to interact with other items in the room to reveal a way to escape. Escape the Room games were born out of freeware browser games created in Adobe Flash, but have since become popular as mobile games for the iOS and Android. Some examples include Crimson Room, Viridian Room, Motas, and Droom. The popularity of these online games has led to the development of real-life escape rooms all around the world. I was actually applying to an escape room place when I was out of work, just looking for a job. I had the opportunity to apply for. I almost had to interview there, but then I got a job, so I didn't have to. Elements of Escape the Room games can be found in other adventure games such as Myst and 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, where a complete puzzle is solved by evaluating the elements within a single room. Games like The Room may also present virtual puzzle boxes that are solved in a similar manner to escape games, by finding out how to open the puzzle box using visual clues on the box and around the environment. The basic gameplay mechanisms of having the player trapped in a single location dates back to at least John Wilson's 1988 text adventure Behind Closed Doors, in which the player is trapped inside a restroom. However, the growth of Escape the Room games is believed to be tied to the popularity of the Myst series, which created puzzles across pre-rendered computer-generated environments, requiring players to look for clues across the landscape. The first game was a landmark title, helping to popularize the use of CD-ROM technology for computers, but as they continued to develop sequels with more ambitious landscapes alongside other developers spurred by Myst's success, adventure game sales flattened. The term originated in 2001 from the Motas game, though there are many older examples of the point-and-click variations such as Noctropolis, and even earlier examples from the text adventure canon. The genre was further popularized in 2004 by the Japanese Crimson Room game by Toshimitsu Takagi, which had spread throughout the internet and can be seen on many gaming websites. While a single location game may not be set inside a room, while the player's goal may not necessarily be escape, 2002 the interactive fiction community first hosted a one-room game competition, attracting 6 entries all in Italian. And in 2006, Riff Connor wrote another goddamn Escape the Locked Room game, indicating that the genre is well known in the contemporary interactive fiction hobbyist community. Most Escape the Room games play from a first-person perspective, where the player must click on objects to interact with them. Most room escape games offer only token plots using a short cutscene consisting only of text to establish how the mirror got there. And sometimes another when the game is finished. Room escapes usually have a minimalistic interface, ambient soundtrack, and no non-player characters. These elements can enhance the gamer's sense of isolation. During gameplay, the player must click on objects to either interact with them or add them to their inventory. As the player passes the mouse over the game screen, usually the mouse cursor will change shape, e.g. to a hand or a different kind of arrow. If the item under the cursor can be used, opened, manipulated, collected, searched, or if it exit, followed. But some games do not provide such hints to the player. The object cannot be collected, opened, used, or manipulated. The player is usually assumed to be inspecting it. In most cases, the player will see a brief text description. The player must collect items and use them with various objects for other items in their inventory to find a way to get out of the room. Some games require the player to solve several rooms in succession. Some require, hello, thank you for the follow. Some require significant amounts of pixel hunting, tedious searching for small clickable. Shoot, I lost my spot. There we go. Some require significant amounts of pixel hunting, tedious searching for a small clickable area, which can frustrate players. For example, when reviewing the PSP game Crimson Room Reverse, a collection of room escape games that were originally free online flash games, critic Brad Galloway said key items are often hidden behind other items, and the player has no way of knowing these areas exist, or that it's possible to search these unless the cursor falls in a very specific location, sometimes a hotspot as small as a few pixels. So yeah, escape the room games. I remember playing a lot of these flash games back, 15 years ago. Maybe 18 years ago. Like 10 years old. Just kind of on my grandparents' computer, just getting very frustrated at these. I would definitely say it does appeal to a very niche area. But, I mean, if you really like puzzles, there are some really good ones out there. I mean, obviously. But, yeah, Escape the Room is just... you gotta really like it to be able to just jump in and say, I'm going for this, and we're only going for this. So, that would be interesting. So, anyway, next up is the non-linear gameplay. I'm not too familiar with this, so I'm hoping that we'll see some of the games that make up non-linear gameplay. So, a video game with non-linear gameplay presents players with challenges that can be completed in a number of different sequences. Each player may take on or even encounter only some of the challenges possible, and the same challenges may be played in a different order. Conversely, a video game with linear gameplay will confront a player with a fixed sequence of challenges. Each player faces every challenge and has to overcome them in the same order. So would non-linear gameplay really just be something that you can do with any game? That gives you the choice. It's like, oh, you'll have to... Let's go to Mass Effect, for example. You need to go to Pharos, you need to go to Vermeer, you need to go to Noveria, and you need to go to that fourth planet. You can do those all in any order that you want. But you have to do all four. So is that non-linear, or is that still linear? Because it still all converges to the same point at the end. But you don't have to do it in the same order. And in fact, you get different interactions depending on how you do it. I don't know. Let's keep reading and figure out. A non-linear game will allow greater player freedom than a linear game. For example, a non-linear game may permit multiple sequences to finish the game, a choice between paths to victory, different types of victory, or optional side quests and side plots. Some games feature both linear and non-linear elements, and some games offer a sandbox mode that allow players to explore an open-world game environment independently from the game's main objectives, if any objectives are provided at all. A game that is significantly non-linear is sometimes described as being open-ended or a sandbox, though that term is used incorrectly in those cases and is characterized by there being no right way of playing the game. Whether intentional or not, a common consequence of open-ended gameplay is emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay refers to complex situations in video games, board games, or tabletop role-playing games that emerge from the interaction of relatively simple gameplay mechanics. That literally does not answer my question, but whatever. So, classification for nonlinear gameplay. So, they generally have, branching storylines. Games that employ linear stories are those where the player cannot change the storyline or ending of the story. Many video games use a linear structure, thus making them more similar to other fiction. However, it is common for such games to use interactive narration in which a player needs to interact with something before the plot will advance, or non-linear narratives, in which events are portrayed in a non-chronological order. Many games have offered premature endings should the player fail to meet an objective, but these are usually just interruptions in a player's progress rather than the actual endings. Even in games with a linear story, players interact with the game world by performing a variety of actions along the way. More recently, some games have begun offering multiple endings to increase the dramatic effect of moral choices within the game, although early examples also exist. Still, some games have gone beyond small choices or special endings, offering a branching storyline known as interactive fiction that players may control at critical points in the game. Sometimes the player is given a choice of which branch of the plot to follow, while sometimes the path will be based on the player's success or failure at a specific challenge. For example, Black Isle Studios' Fallout series of role-playing video games features numerous quests where the player actions dictate the outcome of the story behind the objectives. Players can eliminate in-game characters permanently from the virtual world should they choose to do so, and by doing so they may actually alter the number and type of quests that become available to them as the game progresses. The effects of such decisions may not be immediate. Branches of the story may merge or split at different points of the game, but seldom allow backtracking. Some games even allow for different starting points, and one way this is done is through a character selection screen. Despite experimenting with several non-linear storytelling mechanisms in the 1990s, the gaming industry has largely returned to the practice of linear storytelling. Linear stories cost less time and money to develop, since there is only one fixed sequence of events and no major decisions to keep track of. For example, several games from the Wing Commander series offer a branching storyline, but eventually they were abandoned as being too expensive. Nonlinear stories increases the chance for bugs or absurdities if they are not tested properly, although they do provide greater player freedom. Some players have responded negatively to branching stories because it is hard and tedious for them to experience the full value of all the game's content. As a compromise between linear and branching stories, there are also games where stories split into branches then fold back into a single storyline. In these stories, the plot will branch but then converge upon some inevitable event, giving the impression of a nonlinear gameplay through the use of nonlinear narrative without the use of interactive narratives. This is typically used in many graphic adventure games. A true nonlinear story would be written entirely by the actions of the player and thus remain a difficult design challenge. As such, there is often little or no story in video games with a truly nonlinear gameplay. Facade, a game often characterized as an interactive drama, features many branching paths that are dictated by the user's text input based on the current situation, but there are still a set number of outcomes as a result of the inherent limitations of programming, and as such is nonlinear, but not entirely so. So can you get truly a nonlinear game ever, unless it was... Would AI Dungeon be the only true, non-linear gameplay? With the fact that it's an AI and it can just constantly be generating newer and newer and newer things, it just, there would be no end to it, potentially? I don't know. Visual novels. Branching storylines are a common trend in visual novels, a subgenre of interactive narrative and adventure game. Visual novels frequently use multiple branching storylines to achieve multiple different endings, allowing non-linear freedom of choice along the way. Decision points within a visual novel often present players with the option of altering the course of events during the game, leading to many different possible outcomes. Visual novels are popular in East Asia, especially in Japan, where they account for nearly 70% of personal computer games released there. A rather acclaimed example is 999, 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, where nearly every action and dialogue choice can lead to an entirely new branching path and ending. Each path only reveals certain aspects of the overall storyline, and it is only after uncovering all the possible different paths and outcomes through multiple playthroughs that everything comes together to form a coherent, well-written story. Could you imagine mapping out that game, or every dialogue, every action changes your story just a little bit. That is a lot. It is not uncommon for visual novels to have morality systems. A well-known example is the 2005 title School Days, an animated visual novel that Kotaku described as going well beyond the usual black and white choice systems, referring to video games such as Mass Effect, Fallout 3, and BioShock, where you pick a side and stick with it, while leaving the expansive middle area being between unexplored. School Days instead encourages players to explore the gray neutral middle ground in order to view the more interesting bad endings. It is also not uncommon for visual novels to have multiple protagonists given different perspectives on the story. See, whereas Eve Burst Error introduced a unique twist to the system by allowing the player to switch between both protagonists at any time during the game, instead of finishing one protagonist's scenario before playing the other. Eve Burst Error often requires the player to have both protagonists cooperate with each other at various points during the game, with choices in one scenario affecting the other. Fate/Stay Night is another example that features multiple perspectives. Chunsoft sound novels such as Machi and 428 Shibuya Scramble developed this concept further by allowing the player to alternate between the perspectives of several or more different characters, making choices with one character that have consequences for all the other characters. 428 is a particular example which features up to 85 different possible endings. Holy crap. Some of these I might actually want to take a look into later. So I'm going to click that. I'm going to click that. Well, maybe not that. That looks interesting. Another approach to non-linear storytelling can be seen in Cosmology of Kyoto. The game lacks an overall plot, but it instead presents fragmented narratives and situations in a non-linear manner. As the player character encounters various non-playable characters while wandering the city. These narratives are cross-referenced to an encyclopedia, providing background information as the narratives progress and as the player comes across various characters and locations, with various stories, situations, and related information appearing at distinct locations. It provides enough freedom to allow for the player to experiment with the game, such as using it as a resource for their own role-playing game campaign, for example. And now looking at RPGs for non-linear gameplay. Branching storylines are also often used in role-playing video games to an extent. An early example, published in 1999, is the fantasy role-playing game Might and Magic 7 for Blood and Honor, where players have to choose between light and dark. While the dark side wants to destroy the world of Enroth, the light side tries to save it. The choice determines which Grandmaster levels the player characters can obtain and the quest they have to do in that part of the game. Earlier in the game, the player already has to choose sides in a border conflict between elves and humans or remain neutral. This affects the flag and their castle Harmondale and a few quests, but not the final outcome. Except a second example is Obsidian Entertainment's Fallout New Vegas, where the player's decisions influence whether one of 3 different factions gain control of the area surrounding post-apocalyptic Las Vegas. These factions include Caesar's Legion, a group of Romanesque slavers, the New California Republic, NCR, an expansionist military government, and Mr. House, the enigmatic de facto ruler of New Vegas, in command of an army of robots that patrol the cities. Each of these 3 sides aim to control Hoover Dam, which is still operational and supplying the American Southwest with power and clean, non-irradiated water. Thus, control of the dam means effective control of the region. A fourth option, siding with a robot named Yes Man and prevailing upon eliminating the other faction leaders, enables the player to go solo and take the Hoover Dam for themselves. Another RPG example is Tri-Ace's Star Ocean, where the storyline is not affected by moral alignments like in other RPGs, but inspired by dating sims, by friendship and relationship points between each of the characters. Star Ocean, the the second story in particular offers as many as 86 different endings, with hundreds of permutations setting a benchmark for the number of possible outcomes of a video game. Another unique variation of this system is the Sakura Wars series, which features a real-time branching choice system where during an event or conversation, the player must choose an action or dialogue choice within a time limit or not respond at all within that time. The player's choice, or lack thereof, affects the player character's relationship with other characters and, in turn, the direction and outcome of the storyline. Later games in the series added several variations, including an action gauge that can raised up or down depending on the situation, and a gauge that the player can manipulate using the analog stick depending on the situation. A similar type of conversation system later appeared in a more action role-playing game, also published by Sega, called Alpha Protocol. Another unique take on the concept is combining non-linear branching storytelling with the concept of time travel in parallel universes. Early attempts at such an approach include Squaresoft's Chrono role-playing video game and Elf's visual novel You Know, a girl who chants love at the bound of this world. Radiant Historia takes it further by giving players the freedom to travel backwards and forwards through a timeline to alter the course of history, with each of their choices and actions significantly affecting the timeline. The player can return to certain points in history and live through certain events again to make different choices and see different possible outcomes in the timeline. The player can also travel back and forth between two parallel timelines and can obtain many possible parallel endings. The PSP version of Tactics Ogre featured a world system that allows the player to revisit key points and make different choices to see how the story unfolds differently. And Final Fantasy XIII-2 also features a similar non-linear time travel system called the Radiant Historia, in which you can go back in time and change actions and get entirely different endings by foregoing or doing different actions. Level design. A game level or world can be linear, non-linear, or interactive. In a linear game, there's only one path that the player must take through the level. However, in games with non-linear gameplay, players might have to revisit locations or choose from multiple paths to finish the level. As with other game elements, linear level design is not absolute. While a non-linear level can give the freedom to explore or backtrack, there can be a sequence of challenges that a player must solve to complete the level. If a player must confront the challenges in a fixed order, non-linear games will give multiple approaches to achieve set objectives. A more linear game requires a player to finish levels in a fixed sequence to win. The ability to skip, repeat, or choose between levels makes this game less linear. Super Mario Bros. Is an early example of this, where the player has access to warp zones that skipped many levels of the game. In some games, levels can change between linear design and free roaming depending on the objective of the stage. Super Mario 64 is an example where the main stages are free roam, while the levels where Bowser is encountered follow a straight path to the end. Open worlds and sandbox modes. When a level is sufficiently large and open-ended, it may be described as an open world or sandbox game, though this term is often used incorrectly. Open world game designs have existed in some form since the 1980s, such as the space trading game Elite, and often makes use of procedurally generated environments. In a game with a sandbox mode, a player may turn off or ignore game objectives and have unlimited access to items. This can open up possibilities that were not intended by the game designer. A sandbox mode is an option to otherwise goal-oriented games and is distinguished from open-ended games that have no objectives, such as SimCity and Garry's Mod. I'm very familiar with Garry's Mod. We don't have time to do that, so we'll start with that next time. Interactive film. An interactive film, also known as movie game, is a video game that presents its gameplay in a cinematic, scripted manner, often through the use of FMV, full motion video, of either animated or live action footage. This genre came about with the invention of the Laserdisc and Laserdisc players, the first non-linear or random access video play devices. The fact that a Laserdisc player could jump in and play any chapter instantaneously, rather than proceed in a linear path from start to finish like a videotape, meant that games' branching plotlines could be constructed from out-of-order video chapters, in much the same way as choose-your-adventure books are constructed from out-of-order pages. Thus, interactive movies were animated or filmed with real actors like movies, or in some cases, rendered with 3D models, and followed a main storyline. Alternative scenes were filmed to be triggered after wrong or alternate allowable actions of the players, such as game over scenes. A popular example of commercial interactive movie was the 1983 arcade game Dragon's Lair, featuring a full-motion video cartoon by ex-Disney animator Don Bluth, where the player controlled some of the moves of the main character. When in danger, the player was to decide which move, action, or combination to choose. If they chose the wrong moves, they would see a lose-a-life scene, until they found the correct one, which would allow them to see the rest of the story. There was only one possible successful storyline in Dragon's Lair. The only activity the player had to choose or guess the move the designers intended them to make. Despite lack of choice, Dragon's Lair was very popular. Hardware for these games consisted of a Laserdisc linked to a processor configured with an interface software that assigned a jump to chapter function for each of the controller buttons at each decision point. Much as a choose-your-own-adventure book might say, if you turn left, go to page 7. If you turn right, go to page 8. The controller of Dragon's Lair, or Cliffhanger, was programmed to go to the next chapter in the successful story if the player activated the correct controller, or go to the death chapter if they activated the wrong one. Because Laserdisc players of the day were not robust enough to handle the wear and tear of constant arcade use, they frequently required replacement. Laserdiscs that contained the footage were ordinary Laserdiscs with nothing special about them save for the order of their chapters, and, if removed from the arcade console, would play their video on standard non-interactive Laserdisc players. Later advances in technology allowed interactive movies to overlay multiple fields of FMV called Vites, in which the same way as polygonal models and sprites are overlaid on top of backgrounds in traditional video game graphics. So basically, would you even call that a video game? Like, yes, it's a game, in that you get to make the decisions of the player, but there's only one right way to go through the game, and all you're really trying to do is figure out how to continue watching your movie, right? That's a tough one. Would you really call a interactive movie a game? Yeah, I'm also leaning in that wheelhouse of no, I wouldn't really call that a game, because you're just watching it and you're being like and I just like I wouldn't call a choose your adventure book a game either. I can see how those books are based off of video games, though. And I would easily say that it was inspired by games. Yes, like Black Mirror. Or, there was a movie. What's it called? I don't know. But there's also a movie that also, you got to choose all the decisions. Let's see. Oh, I am thinking of Black Mirror Bandersnatch. Never mind, yeah. Oh, there's also a Heist with Markiplier. I've seen all 31 endings of A Heist with Markiplier, and I believe he's working on a second one. That was actually really fun to do. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call that a video game. It's really just a you have the ability to determine the course of the story. And while, you know, and while you are potentially changing how the story's going, like, those 31 endings in A Heist with Markiplier, like, some of them are fully fleshed out. Like, it'll take you several hours to see all different endings just because, there's just so many different choices. But, it's just, there are things you can do, things that you don't have to do. It's, like, that interaction, it's not a movie, but it's not a game. It's so much more. But I can see why it would be hard to classify, But, yeah. I think that is where we will end it for this week, though. Next week, we have the visual novel, which is the last thing under the adventure game. And then we jump into the RPGs with, the regular RPG article, and then the action RPG, MMORPG, roguelikes, tactical, sandbox, first-person party-based JRPG, and Monster Tamer. So we got a lot of fun coming up. But, yeah, that's going to be it for us today. So I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. And until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.